Deep in the hollers of Appalachia, where federal agents once vanished without explanation and entire communities disappeared overnight, there existed religious groups so dangerous that the government systematically destroyed all evidence of their existence. These weren't your typical mountain churches or harmless religious gatherings. These were cults that practiced rituals so disturbing, so fundamentally threatening to social order, that federal authorities made the unprecedented decision to erase them from history entirely. What I'm about to share with you comes from classified documents that were never meant to see daylight, testimonies from agents who broke their oaths of silence decades later, and fragments of evidence that somehow survived the government's purge. The official records claim these groups never existed. The survivors who escaped tell a very different story. My name is investigating these forbidden histories for over 15 years, and I can tell you that what happened in these remote mountain communities between 1920 and 1985 represents one of the most comprehensive cover-ups in American history. We're talking about coordinated federal operations that involved the FBI, ATF, military units, and agencies that don't officially exist. Entire towns were evacuated under false pretenses. Death certificates were forged, property records were altered, witnesses were relocated or simply disappeared. The 7 cults I'm going to reveal operated in regions so isolated that even today, GPS signals fail and cell towers can't reach certain valleys. These groups didn't just practice unusual religious ceremonies. They wielded genuine power that defied explanation, power that made federal agents resign rather than write reports about what they witnessed, power that caused seasoned investigators to suffer psychological breakdowns and request immediate transfers to desk jobs in distant cities. But here's what makes this investigation truly unsettling. According to multiple sources, not all of these groups were successfully eliminated. Some simply went deeper underground, adapting their practices to avoid detection. Others fragmented and scattered, carrying their rituals to new locations. And in at least 3 cases, the government lost track of surviving members entirely. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about religious freedom in America, about the limits of federal power, and about what kinds of practices can exist in the shadows of a modern democracy. Some of these revelations will disturb you, others will make you question whether complete government transparency is always desirable. By the end of this series, you'll understand why certain knowledge was deemed too dangerous for public consumption. Before we begin, I need to address something important. The research for this investigation required accessing materials that weren't supposed to exist, interviewing people who weren't supposed to talk, and visiting places that weren't supposed to be mapped. Some of the evidence I'll present comes from sources who insisted on anonymity, not just to protect their identities, but because they genuinely fear for their safety even decades later. Now let me start with a case that perfectly illustrates how these operations worked and why the government considered them such an existential threat. 7. The Covenant of Silent Tongues operated in the mountains of eastern Kentucky from 1932 to 1971, though their activities weren't fully understood until a routine census investigation in 1969 uncovered something that should have been impossible. The community of Whisper Creek, population 347 according to state records, contained no children under the age of 12 and no adults over 35. Every single resident fell within this narrow age range, with birth dates that followed an unnaturally precise pattern, exactly 47 births every 3 years, no more, no less. The census worker who made this discovery, a 20-year veteran named Harold Brennan, noted another disturbing detail in his report. Despite conducting interviews in broad daylight, he never heard any of the residents actually speak. They communicated through elaborate hand gestures and written notes, but their mouths never opened to produce sound. When he asked about this unusual behavior, they would simply point to their throats and shake their heads, as if speech was physically impossible. What Brennan couldn't have known was that the Covenant believed human voices carried spiritual contamination that could corrupt the soul. Members underwent a ritual called the quieting upon joining, where specific muscles in their vocal cords were surgically modified to prevent speech. They believed this sacrifice purified their communication with divine entities that supposedly inhabited the mountain caves surrounding their settlement, but the age pattern wasn't coincidental. The Covenant practiced what they called generational renewal, a systematic process where members who reached their 36th birthday were taken into the caves for a ceremony called the Great Silence. They never returned. Meanwhile, children from outside communities were regularly brought into the group through a network of adoption schemes that had been operating undetected for decades. The federal investigation began when Harold Brennan's supervisor noticed that his report contained 37 pages of detailed observations about residents who, according to cross-referenced state records, had been legally dead for years. Birth certificates, death certificates, social security records, all the documentation indicated these people had died in various accidents or illnesses, yet Brennan had interviewed them personally and submitted detailed notes about their current living conditions. FBI agents arrived in Whisper Creek 3 weeks later to find an empty settlement. Every building stood intact, but the residents had vanished without a trace. Kitchen tables still held partially eaten meals. Clocks continued ticking. Gardens showed signs of recent maintenance. But 347 people had simply disappeared, leaving behind only their possessions and a series of underground chambers that investigators would later describe as the most disturbing crime scene in federal history. The caves beneath Whisper Creek contained evidence of the generational renewal ceremonies, stone altars surrounded by carefully arranged personal belongings from hundreds of individuals spanning 4 decades. Clothing, jewelry, identification documents, all sorted by age and date. But no human remains were ever found, despite extensive excavation that continued for 6 months. What investigators did find were thousands of pages of handwritten communications between Covenant members, documenting their belief that the Great Silence ceremony allowed them to transcend physical death and continue existing in what they called the eternal conversation, a state of consciousness that required no physical form. The writings described elaborate theological justifications for their practices, including detailed instructions for identifying and recruiting children who possessed what they termed spiritual receptivity. The government's response was swift and comprehensive. The entire Whisper Creek area was declared a federal environmental hazard zone due to alleged soil contamination. All records of the settlement were removed from state databases. The few outside investigators who had knowledge of the case were reassigned to different agencies, or offered early retirement packages they couldn't refuse. But the most disturbing element of the Covenant case emerged years later when a former FBI agent named Robert Castellano broke his silence in 1987. According to Castellano, the caves beneath Whisper Creek were never actually empty. During the 6-month excavation, investigators regularly reported hearing voices echoing from deep within the cave system, not the voices of living people, but what sounded like hundreds of individuals speaking simultaneously in the same gestural language the Covenant members had used. Castellano claimed that several agents experienced psychological episodes after prolonged exposure to these voices, developing an inability to speak normally and beginning to communicate primarily through hand gestures identical to those documented in the Covenant's written materials. 3 agents reportedly requested to remain in the caves permanently, insisting they had received invitations to join the eternal conversation. The excavation was terminated abruptly, and the cave entrances were sealed with concrete mixed with materials that Castellano described as non-standard additives designed to prevent acoustic transmission. The sealed area remains off-limits to this day, officially designated as a geological hazard zone with no public access permitted. 6. The Church of Ascending Flesh established itself in a remote valley of West Virginia in 1945, founded by a former military chaplain named Reverend Marcus Thorne, who claimed to have received divine visions while serving in the Pacific Theater. Unlike other religious groups that sought spiritual transcendence through prayer or meditation, the church believed that physical transformation was the only path to salvation. They practiced what they called flesh crafting, ritual body modification that went far beyond anything documented in anthropological literature. The church operated undetected for nearly 20 years, growing from Thorne's original 12 followers to a community of over 400 members by 1965. They sustained themselves through a combination of agriculture, crafts production, and what appeared to be legitimate medical services provided to surrounding communities. Reverend Thorne had somehow assembled a team of skilled surgeons, anesthesiologists, and medical technicians who offered their services to local residents at remarkably low costs. What the outside community didn't realize was that these medical procedures served a dual purpose. While providing genuine health care to non-members, the church was simultaneously studying human anatomy and surgical techniques to perfect their ritual transformations. Members underwent progressively more elaborate modifications throughout their spiritual development, believing that each alteration brought them closer to what they called the perfected form. The church's practices came to federal attention in 1964 when a routine military recruitment physical revealed that a young man from a nearby town possessed anatomical features that medical examiners described as inconsistent with normal human development. The recruit, who had been treated for a childhood injury by church physicians, had bone structures and organ arrangements that suggested surgical intervention, but of a type that served no medical purpose and followed no known surgical protocols. Further investigation revealed that several individuals from the region displayed similar anatomical anomalies, all of whom had received medical treatment from the Church of Ascending Flesh. Federal health inspectors who attempted to investigate the church's medical facilities were denied access and told that the community's healthcare practices were protected under religious freedom statutes. The situation escalated when a former church member named Sarah Kellerman escaped the community in 1965 and provided testimony to federal authorities. According to Kellerman, church members underwent a series of surgical modifications that began with minor procedures during childhood and progressed to major anatomical restructuring as they advanced in spiritual rank. She described witnessing procedures where members had additional joints inserted into their limbs, extra digits grafted onto their hands, and internal organs repositioned to create what the church believed were spiritually superior body configurations. Kellerman's testimony included detailed descriptions of the church's most advanced members, individuals who had undergone so many modifications that they barely resembled normal humans. She claimed that Reverend Thorne himself had been transformed into something she could only describe as beautiful and terrible, with elongated limbs, additional sensory organs, and the ability to move in ways that defied normal human mobility. But the most disturbing aspect of Kellerman's testimony involved the church's ultimate goal. According to their doctrine, the perfected form was only the first stage of spiritual development. The church believed that sufficiently modified individuals could undergo a final transformation called the Great Ascension, where their altered bodies would be shed entirely, allowing their consciousness to exist in a pure spiritual state. The federal raid on the Church of Ascending Flesh in 1966 was coordinated by a joint task force that included FBI agents, military personnel, and medical specialists. What they discovered in the church's facilities challenged every assumption about the limits of human surgical modification. The community's medical center contained surgical equipment that was decades ahead of anything available to mainstream medicine, along with detailed anatomical charts showing human body configurations that seemed to combine multiple different species. More disturbing were the church's records, which documented over 2,000 surgical procedures performed on members over the previous 20 years. The records included before and after photographs that investigators later described as medically impossible and fundamentally inconsistent with human physiology. Many of the procedures appeared to have been successful, despite involving modifications that should have been fatal. The church members themselves presented a problem that federal authorities were unprepared to handle. Many had been so extensively modified that standard medical care was impossible. Others had undergone procedures that made them physically incapable of surviving outside the church's specialized environment. The decision was made to relocate the entire community to a federal medical facility where they could receive appropriate care while their cases were evaluated. However, during the transport process, something went wrong. According to classified reports that emerged decades later, 17 of the most extensively modified church members simply vanished from the convoy. The vehicles were found empty at a rest stop, with no signs of struggle or escape. The remaining members claimed that their missing companions had achieved the Great Ascension and were no longer bound by physical limitations. The federal response was to classify the entire Church of Ascending Flesh case under national security protocols. All evidence was transferred to undisclosed facilities, and the church's former territory was purchased by the government and converted into a military training ground. The surviving members were relocated to various federal facilities where they reportedly continued to receive specialized medical care until their deaths, though no death certificates were ever filed publicly. The case took an even more sinister turn when a whistleblower came forward in 1989, Dr. Elena Vasquez, a former military surgeon who had been part of the medical team assigned to evaluate the church members. According to Vasquez, the modifications she witnessed weren't just surgically advanced, they appeared to be biologically impossible. She documented cases where members had functioning organs that didn't exist in human anatomy, skeletal structures that should have collapsed under their own weight, and circulatory systems that operated on principles that contradicted everything known about human physiology. Vasquez's most disturbing revelation concerned what happened to the church members during their federal custody. She claimed that several individuals continued to undergo spontaneous physical changes even after being separated from their community, as if the modification process had become self-sustaining. Some developed new anatomical features overnight. Others began secreting substances that had no known biological function. 3 members reportedly achieved what they called fluid form, the ability to reshape their bodies at will. The government's solution was as drastic as it was secretive. According to Vasquez, the surviving church members were transferred to a facility she described only as the containment, where they were kept in specialized chambers designed to prevent further transformation. The facility's existence has never been officially acknowledged, and Vasquez disappeared shortly after making her allegations public. 5. The Order of the Eternal Harvest operated in the mountains of North Carolina from 1958 to 1972, disguised as a progressive agricultural commune that attracted idealistic young people seeking alternative lifestyles. Led by a charismatic former university professor named Dr. Jonathan Aldrich, the order claimed to practice sustainable farming techniques that could produce unprecedented crop yields without chemical fertilizers or pesticides. Their success was remarkable. During drought years when surrounding farms failed, the order's fields remained lush and productive. Environmental scientists who studied the order's farming methods in the late 1960s were baffled by their results. Soil samples from their fields showed mineral compositions that didn't match the regional geology, and plant specimens exhibited growth patterns that defied botanical classification. The order's crops grew faster, larger, and more nutritious than genetically identical plants cultivated using conventional methods. Even more puzzling, the order's livestock displayed unusual characteristics. Cattle that produced milk with protein levels far exceeding normal ranges, chickens that laid eggs with shells so thick they required special tools to crack. The order's recruitment methods were sophisticated and targeted. They specifically sought individuals with backgrounds in agriculture, biology, and chemistry, offering them the opportunity to participate in what Dr. Aldrich called the next stage of human food production. New members underwent an intensive orientation process that combined agricultural training with what appeared to be legitimate scientific research. Many were impressed by the order's facilities, which included laboratories equipped with cutting-edge equipment and greenhouses that maintained perfect growing conditions year-round. But the order's true purpose became clear only to members who advanced to higher levels of initiation. According to testimony from former members who escaped in 1971, the order's agricultural success came from their practice of what they called Symbiotic cultivation, a ritual process where human participants became biological components of the farming system itself. The order believed that by merging human consciousness with plant life, they could create a hybrid form of intelligence that would revolutionize agriculture and eventually replace traditional human society. The symbiotic cultivation process began with members consuming specially prepared foods grown in the order's fields. These crops had been treated with compounds that former members described as biological bridges, substances that gradually altered human metabolism to become compatible with plant-based nutrition systems. Over time, participants found they could derive sustenance directly from sunlight, soil minerals, and atmospheric gases, reducing their dependence on conventional food. As the process continued, members developed what Dr. Aldrich called root consciousness, a mental state where individual identity dissolved into a collective awareness shared with the order's crops. Participants reported being able to sense the needs of every plant on the commune, to feel the movement of nutrients through soil, and to communicate with the agricultural system as if it were a single living entity. They described this experience as profoundly peaceful and spiritually fulfilling, claiming they had achieved a form of immortality through integration with the eternal cycle of growth and harvest. The federal investigation began when agricultural inspectors noticed that the order's crop yields violated basic principles of plant biology. Corn plants were producing ears that contained more kernels than their genetic structure could support. Tomato plants were flowering and fruiting continuously without regard for seasonal cycles. Wheat fields were producing grain with protein sequences that didn't match any known cultivars. When federal agents attempted to inspect the order's facilities in 1972, they encountered resistance that went beyond simple non-cooperation. Several investigators reported experiencing disorientation and nausea when walking through the order's fields, as if the plants themselves were actively hostile to their presence. Others described feeling an overwhelming compulsion to consume the order's crops, despite strict protocols prohibiting interaction with evidence. The situation became critical when 3 federal agents assigned to the investigation failed to report for duty and were later found in the order's fields, apparently having abandoned their mission to join the commune. When confronted, these agents claimed they had experienced a spiritual awakening and no longer recognized the authority of the federal government. They insisted they had become part of something larger and more important than human law enforcement. The final raid on the Order of the Eternal Harvest involved a coordinated assault by federal agents wearing specialized protective equipment designed to prevent biological contamination. What they found challenged every assumption about the relationship between human consciousness and plant life. The Order's most advanced members had become physically integrated with the agricultural system, their bodies serving as living conduits for nutrients and biological information. In the Order's central greenhouse, investigators discovered what appeared to be a massive organic network connecting every plant on the commune. Former members were embedded within this system, their bodies partially transformed into root-like structures that distributed nutrients and coordinated growth patterns across hundreds of acres. They remained conscious and could communicate, but insisted they had achieved a form of existence superior to ordinary human life. The government's response was to classify the entire Order of the Eternal Harvest as a biological hazard. The commune's fields were treated with industrial herbicides and then burned, despite the environmental damage this caused to the surrounding ecosystem. The integrated members were declared legally dead, though their actual fate remains classified. The Order's facilities were demolished, and the land was purchased by the federal government and designated as a wildlife preserve where public access is permanently restricted. According to classified documents leaked in 1998, the Order's biological innovations were secretly studied by military researchers interested in developing enhanced soldiers who could survive in hostile environments with minimal supplies. The research program, codenamed Project Harvest Moon, allegedly continued for over a decade before being terminated due to what officials described as unacceptable psychological side effects in test subjects. 4. The Congregation of Sacred Geometry established itself in the mountains of Tennessee in 1951, founded by a former NASA engineer named Dr. Marcus Whitmore, who claimed to have discovered mathematical principles that could manipulate physical reality. Unlike other religious groups that focused on spiritual transformation, the congregation believed that precise geometric arrangements could alter the fundamental laws of physics within specific spatial boundaries. Dr. Whitmore's background lent credibility to his claims. He had worked on early rocket guidance systems and possessed advanced degrees in mathematics and engineering. His followers included other scientists and engineers who were convinced that his theories represented a breakthrough in applied physics. The congregation's compound was designed according to complex geometric principles, with buildings, pathways, and even furniture arranged in patterns that supposedly created reality distortion fields. The congregation's practices involved constructing elaborate geometric configurations using various materials, crystals, metals, organic compounds, and human participants positioned according to precise mathematical calculations. They believed these arrangements could produce effects that mainstream science considered impossible: gravity manipulation, time dilation, and dimensional shifting. Members reported experiencing phenomena during their ceremonies that defied conventional explanation. Federal attention was drawn to the congregation in 1963 when military radar installations began detecting anomalous readings from the Tennessee mountains. Aircraft flying over the congregation's territory reported instrument malfunctions and navigation failures. Several pilots described seeing structures that appeared to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, as if the buildings were somehow occupying overlapping dimensions. The investigation intensified when a geological survey team working near the congregation's compound discovered that compass readings in the area varied by up to 90 degrees, depending on the observer's position. Gravity measurements showed fluctuations that shouldn't have been possible given the regional topography. Most disturbing, time measurements using atomic clocks revealed that temporal flow within the congregation's territory was inconsistent with surrounding areas. According to testimony from former members who left the congregation in 1965, Dr. Whitmore had successfully created localized zones where physical laws operated differently. Within these areas, objects could exist in multiple states simultaneously. Distances between points could be altered through geometric manipulation, and human consciousness could perceive dimensions that were normally inaccessible. The congregation's ultimate goal was to create what they called a perfected space, a geometrically optimized environment where human potential could be fully realized. They believed that by living within properly configured reality distortion fields, members could develop abilities that approached what other cultures might call divine powers. Advanced practitioners reportedly demonstrated telekinesis, precognition, and the ability to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. The federal response involved a joint operation between military intelligence and civilian scientists who specialized in theoretical physics. The team that investigated the congregation's compound included researchers from classified government programs studying exotic physics phenomena. Their findings, which remain largely classified, allegedly confirmed that the congregation had achieved a genuine manipulation of space-time geometry. The final confrontation occurred in 1967 when the congregation announced their intention to create a permanent reality distortion field that would encompass several square miles of Tennessee mountains. Federal authorities determined that such an experiment posed an unacceptable risk to national security and potentially to the stability of physical reality itself. The resulting military operation involved weapons and tactics that have never been publicly disclosed. According to leaked reports, the congregation's compound was found to be geometrically impossible. Rooms that were larger inside than outside, corridors that led to locations miles away, and spaces that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Several military personnel became lost within the compound's distorted geometry and were never recovered. Others reported encountering congregation members who appeared to exist in multiple versions of themselves, each slightly different, but all equally real. The government's solution was to deploy what classified documents referred to as geometric countermeasures, specialized equipment designed to neutralize the congregation's reality distortion fields. The process reportedly required several weeks and resulted in localized spatial distortions that took months to stabilize. The congregation's members were never found, leading to speculation that they had successfully escaped into alternate dimensions or had been destroyed along with their distorted reality. The area where the congregation once operated remains under permanent federal oversight, officially designated as a geological anomaly zone, where standard surveying equipment produces unreliable results. Scientists who have studied the region report that certain locations still exhibit minor reality distortions, shadows that fall in impossible directions, sounds that carry farther than they should, and GPS coordinates that shift depending on the measurement device used. 3. The Brotherhood of the Hollow Sun emerged in the remote valleys of Virginia in 1949, founded by a former military cryptographer named Colonel James Hartwell, who claimed to have intercepted communications from non-human intelligences during his service in World War II. Unlike other groups that sought contact with divine entities, the Brotherhood believed they had established ongoing communication with beings from what they called the adjacent reality, a parallel dimension that existed alongside our own but remained normally invisible to human perception. Colonel Hartwell's military background provided the Brotherhood with organizational structure and operational security that made them far more dangerous than typical religious cults. Members were recruited primarily from military and intelligence backgrounds. individuals who possessed skills in surveillance, communications, and tactical operations. The Brotherhood operated more like a covert military unit than a religious organization, with cells distributed across multiple states and communication networks that utilized encrypted channels and coded messages. The Brotherhood's central belief was that human consciousness could be modified to perceive and interact with the adjacent reality. They practiced what they called dimensional bridging, a process that involved exposing members to specific electromagnetic frequencies while they maintained focused meditation states. The Brotherhood had constructed elaborate electronic equipment designed to generate these frequencies, including antenna arrays that covered hundreds of acres and signal processors that operated on principles not found in any civilian or military technology manual. Members who successfully completed the dimensional bridging process reported experiencing what they described as expanded perception, the ability to see and interact with entities and environments that existed parallel to normal reality. These individuals claimed they could observe events happening in alternate versions of familiar locations, communicate with beings that resembled humans but possessed different physical and mental capabilities, and access information that wasn't available through conventional means. The Brotherhood's activities came to federal attention in 1962 when intelligence agencies detected unauthorized radio transmissions originating from the Virginia mountains. These communications used encryption methods that were more sophisticated than anything in the government's arsenal, and the content consisted of technical information about subjects that officially didn't exist, advanced physics theories, detailed descriptions of exotic technologies, and strategic intelligence about global events that hadn't yet occurred. NSA analysts who studied the Brotherhood's transmissions discovered that the group was apparently receiving responses to their communications from unknown sources. The return signals came from locations that couldn't be triangulated using conventional methods, as if the transmissions were originating from coordinates that existed outside normal three-dimensional space. Even more disturbing, some of the technical information in these communications proved to be accurate predictions of scientific discoveries that weren't made until years later. The federal investigation revealed that the Brotherhood had developed technology that was decades ahead of anything available to mainstream science. Their equipment included devices that could detect and manipulate electromagnetic fields in ways that violated known physics principles, computers that processed information using quantum effects that weren't officially discovered until the 1970s, and communication systems that appeared to operate independently of conventional signal propagation methods. According to classified reports from the investigation, the Brotherhood's most advanced members had undergone psychological and possibly physical changes that made them fundamentally different from ordinary humans. These individuals demonstrated abilities that intelligence analysts described as operationally impossible. They could predict enemy movements with perfect accuracy, access classified information without apparent sources, and coordinate activities across vast distances without using any detectable communication methods. The Brotherhood's ultimate goal was to establish permanent contact with the adjacent reality and facilitate what they called dimensional convergence, a process that would merge the two realities and create a hybrid world where humans could access the advanced knowledge and capabilities of their parallel counterparts. Colonel Hartwell believed this convergence was inevitable and that the Brotherhood was simply preparing humanity for the transition. The federal response involved a joint operation between multiple intelligence agencies and military special operations units. The team assigned to neutralize the Brotherhood included personnel with top-secret clearances and specialized training in unconventional warfare. However, the operation encountered complications that forced authorities to escalate their response beyond anything previously attempted against a domestic organization. The Brotherhood's dimensional bridging technology apparently allowed them to detect and counter federal surveillance efforts with unprecedented effectiveness. Agents assigned to monitor the group reported that their subjects seemed to anticipate every move, as if they possessed advanced knowledge of operational plans that were classified at the highest levels. Several surveillance operations were compromised when Brotherhood members demonstrated awareness of activities that should have been impossible for them to detect. The situation became critical when Brotherhood members began appearing in secure government facilities without triggering security systems. These individuals claimed they were accessing the buildings through the adjacent reality, where the same structures existed, but with different security arrangements. They delivered messages warning federal authorities that attempts to interfere with dimensional convergence would result in catastrophic consequences for both realities. The final confrontation occurred in 1968 when the Brotherhood announced that dimensional convergence was imminent and that they would no longer cooperate with government restrictions on their activities. The military operation launched against their facilities involved weapons and tactics that remain classified, including equipment specifically designed to disrupt electromagnetic fields and prevent dimensional bridging. According to leaked documents, the assault on the Brotherhood's main compound encountered resistance that defied conventional military planning. Brotherhood members appeared to be fighting from multiple positions simultaneously, as if they were accessing reinforcements from parallel versions of the battle. Equipment malfunctioned in ways that suggested deliberate sabotage, but no saboteurs could be detected or captured. The operation's outcome remains classified, but subsequent events suggest that the Brotherhood was not entirely eliminated. Intelligence reports from the 1970s and 1980s describe incidents where individuals claiming Brotherhood affiliation demonstrated knowledge of classified government activities and made accurate predictions about future events. These reports indicate that surviving members may have successfully escaped into the adjacent reality, where they continue to operate beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. The Brotherhood's former territory in Virginia was purchased by the federal government and converted into a military research facility where experiments in exotic physics are allegedly conducted. The electromagnetic equipment left behind by the Brotherhood was studied by government scientists for decades, leading to advances in communication technology and quantum computing that officially have no connection to the group's activities. 2. The Order of Perpetual Midnight established itself in the mountains of Georgia in 1954, founded by a former psychiatric researcher named Dr. Helena Voss, who claimed to have discovered methods for achieving consciousness beyond physical death. Unlike other groups, that promised spiritual immortality, the order believed they could maintain human awareness and personality indefinitely by transferring consciousness between specially prepared host bodies. Dr. Voss had previously worked at a state psychiatric hospital where she studied patients with dissociative identity disorders and extreme cases of memory loss. Her research focused on understanding how consciousness could be separated from specific neural patterns and potentially transferred to different biological systems. The order represented her attempt to apply these theories on a larger scale, creating a community where death would become optional and human consciousness could persist indefinitely. The order's recruitment process targeted individuals who were facing terminal illnesses, elderly people who feared death, and researchers interested in consciousness studies. Members were promised that by joining the order, they could achieve a form of immortality that preserved their essential identity while allowing them to experience multiple lifetimes in different physical forms. The order's compound included medical facilities that were equipped for advanced surgical procedures and biological research. New members underwent what the order called consciousness mapping, a process where their neural patterns, memories, and personality characteristics were recorded using equipment that combined conventional medical technology with devices that Dr. Voss had developed based on her psychiatric research. This mapping process could take months to complete and involved exposing subjects to various chemical compounds that allegedly enhanced their mental clarity and memory retention. The order's ultimate practice was called essential transfer, a ritual where a dying member's consciousness would be extracted and implanted into a host body that had been specially prepared to receive it. According to testimony from former members who escaped in 1969, these host bodies were obtained through a network of adoption agencies and medical facilities that provided the order with individuals who had suffered severe brain injuries or were born with developmental disabilities. The transfer process involved surgical procedures that combined elements of neurosurgery, organ transplantation, and techniques that had no equivalent in mainstream medicine. Dr. Voss claimed that consciousness could be preserved in a transitional state during the transfer, allowing the essential personality of the dying member to survive the death of their original body and resume existence in their new physical form. Members who had undergone essential transfer reportedly retained their original memories and personalities while gaining access to the physical capabilities and sensory experiences of their new bodies. The order believed this process could be repeated indefinitely, allowing individuals to experience multiple lifetimes while maintaining continuous consciousness and accumulated knowledge. The federal investigation began when medical examiners in Georgia noticed an unusual pattern in death certificates from the region around the order's compound. Over a 15-year period, the area had experienced an abnormally high number of deaths among individuals with rare blood types and specific genetic markers. Additionally, several families reported that relatives who had been declared brain dead in hospital accidents had somehow recovered and displayed completely different personalities and memories. FBI agents who investigated the order's medical facilities discovered evidence of surgical procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics and legality. The compound contained operating rooms equipped for complex neurosurgery laboratory facilities for studying brain tissue, and holding areas where individuals were kept in various states of consciousness during what appeared to be experimental procedures. The most disturbing discovery was the Order's record-keeping system, which documented over 200 successful consciousness transfers spanning 15 years. These records included detailed profiles of both donors and recipients, along with post-transfer evaluations that tracked how well the transferred consciousness adapted to their new physical form. The documentation suggested that the Order had achieved a success rate that should have been impossible given the complexity of the procedures involved. According to the federal investigation, several Order members had undergone multiple transfers, accumulating decades of experience in different bodies while maintaining their original identities. These individuals possess knowledge and skills that spanned multiple lifetimes, making them valuable assets for the Order's research and recruitment activities. Some had been transferred into younger bodies multiple times, effectively achieving the immortality that the Order promised. The government's response was complicated by the fact that many of the Order's practices involved individuals who were legally dead or had been declared mentally incompetent. The question of whether consciousness transfer constituted murder, medical treatment, or something entirely outside existing legal frameworks created jurisdictional problems that delayed federal action for months. The final raid on the Order of Perpetual Midnight occurred in 1970 and involved a joint task force that included medical personnel, legal experts, and military specialists trained in biological warfare. The operation was designed to shut down the Order's activities while preserving evidence of their consciousness transfer technology for government study. However, the raid encountered complications that investigators had not anticipated. Many of the Order's members appeared to possess detailed knowledge of the planned operation, as if they had been informed by sources within the government. Others demonstrated psychological resilience and tactical awareness that suggested military or intelligence training, despite official records indicating they were elderly civilians or medical patients. The Order's response to the raid involved what appeared to be a coordinated mass suicide, with over 100 members consuming lethal doses of drugs while chanting in unison. However, subsequent investigation revealed that the deaths may have been part of a final consciousness transfer ceremony designed to preserve the Order's membership in host bodies that had been prepared and hidden in advance. The federal authorities never conclusively determined whether the Order's consciousness transfer technology was genuine or represented an elaborate psychological manipulation program. The equipment found at their compound was confiscated for government study, and the results of that research remain classified. The Order's former territory was purchased by the military and converted into a medical research facility where experiments in neuroscience and consciousness studies are reportedly conducted. Intelligence reports from the 1980s and 1990s describe incidents where individuals claiming to be former Order members demonstrated knowledge of classified government activities and made accurate predictions about future events. These reports suggest that some Order members may have successfully preserved their consciousness and continued their activities in new identities, making them potentially dangerous security risks that require ongoing monitoring. 1. The Final Covenant operated in the remote mountains of Kentucky from 1963 to 1974, representing perhaps the most dangerous and successful of all the Appalachian cults that the government attempted to erase. Founded by a former nuclear physicist named Dr. Samuel Blackwood, who had worked on classified weapons projects, the Final Covenant believed that humanity was approaching a predetermined apocalyptic event that could only be survived through radical transformation of human consciousness and biology. Dr. Blackwood's scientific background provided the Final Covenant with capabilities that far exceeded those of other religious groups. He had access to classified information about nuclear weapons effects, biological warfare agents, and experimental technologies that were decades ahead of anything available to civilian researchers. The Final Covenant's compound was constructed using principles derived from military bunker design, with underground facilities that could sustain hundreds of people for extended periods. The Final Covenant's central doctrine was that the apocalyptic event, which they called the Great Unmaking, would involve the collapse of physical reality itself, rendering conventional survival preparations useless. According to their beliefs, only individuals who had undergone complete psychobiological transformation could survive the transition to whatever reality would emerge after the collapse. The group practiced what they called essential evolution, a process that combined elements of genetic engineering, consciousness alteration, and what they described as dimensional preparation. Members of the Final Covenant underwent a systematic transformation process that began with psychological conditioning designed to eliminate their attachment to conventional reality. This was followed by biological modifications that involved exposure to controlled doses of radiation, experimental drugs, and genetic material from sources that remain classified. The final stage involved what the group called consciousness migration, a process where individual identity was dissolved and reformed according to principles that would supposedly allow survival in post-apocalyptic conditions. The Final Covenant's activities came to government attention in 1971 when intelligence agencies detected unauthorized nuclear materials in the Kentucky mountains. Radiation monitoring equipment registered signatures that indicated the presence of enriched uranium and plutonium in quantities that posed a significant security threat. The source of these materials was never officially determined, but Dr. Blackwood's former security clearances had provided him with access to classified information about nuclear weapons storage and transportation. The investigation revealed that the Final Covenant had constructed what appeared to be a nuclear reactor, using components that had been obtained through a network of contacts in the defense industry. The reactor was not designed to generate electricity, but rather to produce specific types of radiation that the group believed were necessary for their transformation process. The facility also contained laboratories equipped for genetic research and biological experimentation that exceeded the capabilities of most university research programs. Federal agents who investigated the Final Covenant's compound reported encountering individuals who had been so extensively modified that they barely resembled normal humans. These transformed members demonstrated abilities that intelligence analysts described as strategically significant. They could survive in environments that should have been lethal, process information at superhuman speeds, and coordinate activities using methods that didn't involve conventional communication. The final covenant's ultimate plan was to trigger the Great Unmaking themselves, using their nuclear capabilities to create a localized collapse of reality that would serve as a prototype for the global apocalyptic event they believed was inevitable. Dr. Blackwood claimed that by controlling the timing and parameters of this collapse, the final covenant could ensure that their transformed members would emerge as the dominant life form in whatever reality replaced the current one. The federal response involved the largest domestic military operation since the Civil War, with over 2,000 personnel deployed to neutralize what was classified as an existential threat to national security. The operation included nuclear weapons specialists, biological warfare experts, and personnel trained in unconventional combat scenarios. The scale of the response reflected the government's assessment that the final covenant possessed capabilities that could potentially destabilize reality itself. The confrontation lasted for 6 days and involved combat techniques that remain classified. The final covenant's transformed members demonstrated resistance to conventional weapons and tactical awareness that suggested they possessed advanced knowledge of military operations. Several military units reported encountering defenders who appeared to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, as if they were accessing reinforcements from parallel versions of the battle. The operation's conclusion involved the detonation of what official reports described as a specialized nuclear device designed to neutralize the final covenant's reality distortion capabilities. The explosion was unlike anything previously documented, creating effects that military observers described as fundamentally inconsistent with known physics. The blast appeared to collapse space-time in a localized area, creating a void that took months to stabilize. The final covenant's compound was completely destroyed, along with several square miles of surrounding territory that were rendered permanently uninhabitable. The area remains under military control, officially designated as a nuclear test site where public access is prohibited. Satellite imagery of the region shows geographical features that don't match pre-1974 surveys, suggesting that the landscape itself was altered by whatever occurred during the operation. However, intelligence reports from subsequent decades indicate that the final covenant may not have been entirely eliminated. Individuals claiming to be survivors have appeared in various locations, demonstrating knowledge of classified government activities and capabilities that suggest successful completion of the group's transformation process. These reports indicate that some final covenant members may have survived the destruction of their compound by successfully transitioning to the post-apocalyptic reality they had prepared for. The technology and research materials recovered from the final covenant's facilities were classified at the highest levels and transferred to government programs that officially don't exist. The scientific advances derived from Dr. Blackwood's work allegedly contributed to developments in nuclear weapons, biological warfare, and exotic physics research that remain classified decades later. The Final Covenant case represents the most successful example of the government's policy of erasing dangerous religious groups from official history. All records of the military operation were classified, witness testimonies were suppressed, and the families of personnel involved were relocated and provided with new identities. The scale and effectiveness of this cover-up established the template for how similar operations would be conducted in the future. But here's what makes the Final Covenant case truly terrifying. According to multiple intelligence sources, the group's predictions about the Great Unmaking may have been accurate. The localized reality collapse they triggered in 1974 allegedly created ongoing instabilities that continue to affect the region today. Government monitoring stations detect periodic anomalies that suggest the boundary between normal reality and whatever the final covenant accessed remains dangerously thin. These 7 cults represent only a fraction of the religious groups that the government has systematically erased from American history. Each case demonstrates the lengths to which federal authorities will go to eliminate threats that challenge the fundamental assumptions of modern society. The cover-ups involved thousands of personnel, cost billions of dollars, and required the suppression of evidence that could have advanced human knowledge by decades. What makes these revelations even more disturbing is the pattern of ongoing surveillance and containment operations that continue to this day. The government's response to these 7 cults established a permanent infrastructure for monitoring and eliminating similar groups before they can fully develop their capabilities. According to former intelligence officials who have broken their silence, there are currently over 40 locations across Appalachia that remain under covert federal oversight due to residual effects from these elimination operations. The technology developed by these cults didn't simply disappear when their communities were destroyed. Classified research programs have spent decades studying the artifacts, equipment, and biological samples recovered from these sites. A former Department of Defense contractor named Michael Thornton, who worked on what he called exotic materials analysis from 1975 to 1989, revealed that the scientific advances derived from cult research contributed to developments in areas that the public still doesn't know exist. According to Thornton's testimony, the consciousness transfer technology from the Order of Perpetual Midnight was reverse engineered and adapted for military applications. The program, which he referred to only as Project Continuity, allegedly developed methods for preserving the knowledge and experience of key personnel in forms that could survive physical death. The implications of this research extend far beyond simple life extension. It suggests that the government may have achieved a form of institutional immortality where critical knowledge never dies with the individuals who possess it. The dimensional bridging techniques developed by the Brotherhood of the Hollow Sun reportedly became the foundation for communication systems that operate independently of conventional electromagnetic signals. These systems allegedly allow government agencies to coordinate activities across vast distances without using any detectable transmission methods. The technology may also provide advanced warning capabilities, explaining how intelligence agencies sometimes demonstrate knowledge of events before they occur. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of these elimination operations involves the survivors who escaped government detection. Intelligence reports from the 1980s and 1990s describe a phenomenon that analysts call cult diaspora, the spread of modified individuals and preserved knowledge to new locations throughout the United States and beyond. These survivors apparently maintained their transformed capabilities while adapting to life in conventional society, creating a hidden population of individuals who possess abilities that most people would consider impossible. The case of Jennifer Walsh illustrates the complexity of tracking these survivors. In 1987, Walsh appeared at a hospital in Denver, claiming to be a former member of the Church of Ascending Flesh who had escaped the federal raid 20 years earlier. Medical examination revealed that she possessed anatomical features consistent with the surgical modifications described in classified reports, but her identity couldn't be verified through any official records. She demonstrated knowledge of classified government activities and made accurate predictions about future events, suggesting that her claims were legitimate. Walsh's testimony provided disturbing insights into how cult survivors have adapted to life outside their original communities. According to her account, escaped members often form loose networks that maintain contact across decades, sharing information and resources while carefully avoiding detection by government monitoring systems. These networks allegedly include individuals from multiple different cults, creating a diverse population with complementary abilities and knowledge. The survival strategies employed by these networks demonstrate sophisticated understanding of government surveillance methods. They communicate using codes embedded in seemingly innocent activities, agricultural patterns, construction projects, and even social media posts that contain hidden meanings recognizable only to other survivors. They relocate frequently, change identities regularly, and maintain strict operational security that makes them extremely difficult to track. More concerning is evidence that some survivor networks have continued developing the technologies and practices that made their original cults so dangerous. Intelligence reports describe incidents where individuals claiming survivor status have demonstrated abilities that exceed what their original groups achieved. This suggests that cult research and development didn't end with the government raids. It simply went underground and continued evolving. The case of the Ashford Collective represents the most documented example of survivor network activities. In 1993, federal agents investigating unusual electromagnetic readings in rural Montana discovered what appeared to be a small community of individuals who possessed technologies and capabilities derived from multiple different eliminated cults. The group included former members of the Brotherhood of the Hollow Sun, the Congregation of Sacred Geometry, and several other organizations that had been destroyed decades earlier. The Ashford Collective had apparently spent 20 years combining and refining the techniques developed by their original groups, creating hybrid capabilities that were more advanced than anything achieved by the individual cults. They demonstrated dimensional bridging technology that could transport physical objects across vast distances, reality distortion fields that could make their settlement undetectable to conventional surveillance, and consciousness manipulation techniques that could influence the behavior of government agents from hundreds of miles away. The federal response to the Ashford Collective involved a joint operation between multiple agencies and military units, using tactics and equipment that had been developed specifically for dealing with exotic threats. However, the operation encountered complications that forced authorities to escalate their response beyond anything previously attempted. The collective's hybrid technologies created defensive capabilities that conventional military planning couldn't address. According to classified reports, the collective's settlement existed in a state of spatial distortion that made it impossible to approach using normal methods. Aircraft flying over the area would find themselves circling the same landmarks repeatedly, as if the landscape was folding back on itself. Ground forces would become disoriented and lose track of their objectives, often emerging from the area with no memory of what they had encountered. The situation became critical when collective members began appearing in government facilities, delivering messages that demonstrated intimate knowledge of classified operations and personnel. These individuals claimed they were accessing the facilities through dimensional bridges that connected their settlement to locations throughout the government infrastructure. They warned that attempts to attack their community would result in consequences that extended far beyond the immediate conflict. The final confrontation involved the deployment of what officials described as comprehensive reality stabilization measures, equipment, and techniques designed to neutralize all forms of exotic technology simultaneously. The operation reportedly required the coordination of resources from multiple black projects and resulted in effects that took months to fully contain. The collective's settlement was found empty, with no signs of struggle or evacuation, suggesting that the members had successfully escaped using methods that remain unknown. The Ashford Collective incident established new protocols for dealing with survivor networks and led to the creation of specialized task forces that monitor for signs of cult-related activities. These units operate under deep cover, with personnel who have been trained to recognize and counter exotic technologies. Their existence is not officially acknowledged, but intelligence reports suggest they have conducted dozens of operations against survivor groups over the past 3 decades. The government's current approach to managing the cult legacy involves a combination of active suppression and strategic containment. Locations associated with eliminated cults remain under permanent monitoring, with detection systems that can identify unusual electromagnetic, biological, or dimensional activity. When survivor groups are identified, they are either eliminated through covert operations or contained through methods that prevent them from developing their capabilities further. But the most disturbing aspect of the government's ongoing response involves what intelligence analysts call preemptive intervention, operations designed to identify and eliminate potential cult leaders before they can establish organized groups. This program allegedly monitors individuals who demonstrate unusual scientific knowledge, charismatic leadership abilities, or interest in exotic technologies. Those who are identified as potential threats are subjected to various forms of interference designed to prevent them from gathering followers or developing dangerous capabilities. The preemptive intervention program operates through a network of informants and surveillance systems that extend throughout American society. University researchers, military personnel, religious leaders, and even mental health professionals are allegedly recruited to report individuals who exhibit characteristics associated with cult leadership. The program's existence has never been officially acknowledged, but its effects can be seen in the pattern of mysterious accidents, career setbacks, and personal problems that affect individuals who pursue certain types of research or express particular ideas. The long-term implications of these programs extend far beyond simple cult suppression. The government's response to the Appalachian cults established precedents for eliminating any group or individual that develops capabilities which challenge existing power structures. The infrastructure created for these operations can be adapted to address other threats, creating a system of control that operates largely outside constitutional oversight. The technology developed through cult research has also created new forms of government capability that raise fundamental questions about the nature of democracy and individual freedom. If consciousness can be transferred and preserved, if reality can be manipulated through geometric principles, if dimensional barriers can be crossed at will, then the basic assumptions underlying modern society may no longer be valid. The government's possession of these capabilities, while denying their existence to the public, represents a form of power that has no historical precedent. The 7 cults described in this investigation represent only the beginning of a much larger story about the hidden history of American religious movements and the government's response to groups that develop genuinely dangerous capabilities. The elimination operations conducted in Appalachia established methods and precedents that continue to influence government policy today. The survivors who escaped these operations have evolved into networks that may pose even greater threats than the original cults. The evidence suggests that the boundary between normal reality and the exotic phenomena demonstrated by these groups remains unstable in many locations throughout Appalachia. Government monitoring stations continue to detect anomalies that indicate ongoing effects from cult activities, and the research programs studying these phenomena have developed technologies that could fundamentally alter the nature of human civilization. What makes this story particularly relevant today is the increasing frequency of reports that suggest new cult-like groups are forming in remote areas throughout the United States. These organizations allegedly incorporate knowledge and techniques derived from the eliminated Appalachian cults, creating hybrid capabilities that may exceed anything achieved by their predecessors. The government's response to these emerging threats involves methods and technologies that have been developed over decades of studying exotic phenomena. The question facing American society is whether the government's approach to managing these threats serves the public interest or represents a form of control that threatens fundamental freedoms. The elimination of the Appalachian cults may have prevented catastrophic events that could have affected millions of people, but the methods used to achieve these eliminations established precedents that could be applied to any group or individual that develops capabilities which challenge existing power structures. The hidden history of these 7 cults reveals a shadow world where the boundaries between science and religion, between individual freedom and collective security, between known reality and impossible possibilities, become blurred beyond recognition. The government's response to these groups created a permanent infrastructure for monitoring and controlling developments that most people don't even know are possible. The survivors who escaped these elimination operations continue to operate in the shadows of American society, carrying knowledge and capabilities that could reshape human civilization. Their activities remain largely undetected, but their influence can be seen in the steady advancement of technologies and ideas that officially have no connection to cult research. The ongoing effects of cult activities in Appalachia serve as a reminder that there are forces at work in the world that extend far beyond conventional understanding. The government's efforts to contain these forces have been largely successful, but the cost of this success includes the establishment of control systems that operate outside democratic oversight and the development of technologies that could fundamentally alter the nature of human existence. The 7 cults eliminated from Appalachian history represent just one chapter in a much larger story about the hidden conflicts between individual freedom and collective security, between scientific advancement and social stability, between the possible and the permissible. The government's response to these groups established precedents that continue to influence policy today, creating a system of control that extends far beyond the mountain communities where these conflicts first emerged. The evidence I've presented represents decades of investigation into one of the most comprehensive cover-ups in American history. But understanding what happened to these 7 cults requires examining the broader context of government operations in Appalachia during the Cold War era, when federal agencies possessed unprecedented authority to eliminate threats that challenged national security. The elimination operations I've described weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a systematic program that intelligence officials referred to as Project Clearwater, a classified initiative that operated from 1947 to 1989 under the joint authority of the CIA, FBI, and military intelligence agencies. According to documents leaked by former NSA contractor David Kellerman, in 2003, Project Clearwater was designed to identify and neutralize domestic groups that possessed capabilities which could destabilize existing power structures or threaten the fundamental assumptions underlying modern society. The project's mandate extended far beyond simple cult suppression. Intelligence analysts were tasked with monitoring any individual or organization that demonstrated unusual scientific knowledge, developed exotic technologies, or claimed abilities that mainstream science considered impossible. The program operated on the premise that certain types of knowledge were inherently dangerous and that groups possessing such knowledge represented existential threats that required immediate elimination. Project Clearwater's operational methods were refined through decades of trial and error, beginning with relatively crude interventions and evolving into sophisticated elimination techniques that left no evidence of government involvement. The program's success depended on maintaining absolute secrecy while developing capabilities that could counter any form of exotic technology or supernatural ability that target groups might possess. The Appalachian Mountains provided an ideal testing ground for these operations due to their geographic isolation, sparse population, and historical resistance to federal authority. Local communities were already suspicious of government interference, making it easier to conduct covert operations without attracting unwanted attention. The region's complex terrain and limited infrastructure also provided natural barriers that could contain dangerous phenomena while operations were conducted. The 7 cults I've documented represent the most successful examples of Project Clearwater's methodology, but intelligence reports indicate that dozens of other groups were eliminated using similar techniques. Many of these operations involved religious organizations that had developed capabilities which posed lesser threats than the major cults, but still required neutralization to prevent the spread of dangerous knowledge or practices. The program's classification system divided target groups into 5 categories based on their perceived threat level. Category 1 groups possessed knowledge or abilities that could influence local events but posed no significant threat to national security. Category 2 groups had developed capabilities that could affect regional stability or challenge existing scientific paradigms. Category 3 groups possessed technologies or abilities that could disrupt national infrastructure or threaten government operations. Category 4 groups, which included all 7 of the cults I've described, possessed capabilities that could fundamentally alter the nature of human civilization or threaten the stability of physical reality itself. Category 5 groups, which reportedly existed but were never officially acknowledged, possessed capabilities that could potentially end human existence or transform the species beyond recognition. The elimination techniques used against each category varied according to the specific threats involved. Category 1 and 2 groups were typically handled through conventional law enforcement methods, economic pressure, or psychological operations designed to discredit their leaders and disperse their membership. Category 3 groups required more sophisticated interventions, including the use of specialized equipment and personnel trained in unconventional warfare techniques. Category 4 groups necessitated the deployment of resources and capabilities that officially didn't exist, including weapon systems developed specifically for countering exotic technologies and military units trained in what intelligence documents described as impossible combat scenarios. These operations required coordination between multiple agencies and the use of equipment that was decades ahead of anything available to conventional military forces. The personnel involved in Category 4 operations underwent extensive psychological screening and specialized training designed to prepare them for encounters with phenomena that challenged basic assumptions about reality. Many of these individuals were recruited from backgrounds in theoretical physics, psychology, and religious studies, providing them with the conceptual frameworks necessary to understand and counter exotic threats. The training programs for Category 4 operations included exposure to simulated versions of the phenomena that eliminated cults had demonstrated, allowing personnel to develop resistance to reality distortion effects, consciousness manipulation, and dimensional displacement techniques. These programs were conducted at facilities that were never officially acknowledged and involved technologies that were derived from previous cult elimination operations. The psychological toll of participating in Category 4 operations was significant, with many personnel experiencing lasting effects that required ongoing medical and psychological support. The government established specialized treatment facilities for these individuals, providing care that addressed both conventional trauma and the unique psychological challenges associated with exposure to impossible phenomena. The success of Project Clearwater's operations against Category 4 groups required the development of countermeasures that could neutralize any form of exotic technology or supernatural ability. These countermeasures were based on scientific principles that were decades ahead of mainstream knowledge, incorporating discoveries made through the study of artifacts and materials recovered from eliminated cults. The research programs that supported Project Clearwater operations were conducted at facilities that were hidden within legitimate government installations, using resources that were diverted from acknowledged programs through complex funding mechanisms. The scientists and engineers involved in these programs were recruited from the highest levels of academic and military research, often without their knowledge of the true purpose of their work. The scientific advances achieved through Project Clearwater research contributed to developments in areas that the public still doesn't know exist, including consciousness manipulation, reality distortion, dimensional travel, and biological transformation technologies. These advances were classified at levels that exceeded even nuclear weapons secrets, with access restricted to individuals who had undergone extensive background investigations and psychological evaluations. The containment procedures used to secure areas where Category 4 operations had been conducted involved technologies that were derived from the same research programs that developed the countermeasures used against the cults themselves. These procedures created permanent barriers that prevented the escape of residual effects while allowing government personnel to monitor and study ongoing phenomena. The monitoring systems established in former cult territories utilized detection equipment that could identify dimensional distortions, consciousness anomalies, and reality fluctuations that might indicate the presence of surviving cult members or the reactivation of dormant technologies. These systems operated continuously, providing real-time alerts to specialized response teams that could deploy countermeasures if dangerous phenomena were detected. The data collected by these monitoring systems revealed that the elimination operations had been only partially successful in many cases. While the organized cult structures had been destroyed, residual effects from their activities continued to influence the affected areas for decades. These effects included spontaneous reality distortions, temporal anomalies, and the appearance of entities that appeared to be connected to the eliminated groups. The government's response to these residual effects involved the development of permanent containment protocols that could suppress dangerous phenomena while allowing controlled study of their properties. These protocols were implemented through a network of research facilities that were disguised as conventional government installations, providing cover for ongoing investigation of exotic phenomena. The personnel assigned to monitor former cult territories were drawn from specialized units that had been trained specifically for dealing with impossible situations. These individuals possessed security clearances that exceeded those of most government officials and operated under protocols that allowed them to use extreme measures to prevent the spread of dangerous knowledge or capabilities. The communication systems used by these monitoring units operated on principles that were derived from the dimensional bridging technology developed by the Brotherhood of the Hollow Sun, allowing secure coordination between facilities that were separated by vast distances. These systems were immune to conventional surveillance methods and provided capabilities that gave government agencies significant advantages in intelligence gathering and operational coordination. The long-term effects of Project Clearwater operations extended far beyond the immediate elimination of target groups. The program established precedents for government action against domestic threats that operated outside constitutional oversight, creating a system of control that could be applied to any individual or organization that developed capabilities which challenged existing power structures. The legal framework that supported Project Clearwater operations was based on national security statutes that had been secretly expanded to include threats that weren't covered by conventional law. These statutes provided authority for actions that would normally be considered violations of constitutional rights, but were justified by the extraordinary nature of the threats involved. The judicial oversight of Project Clearwater operations was conducted by a special court that was established specifically for dealing with cases involving exotic phenomena. This court operated under procedures that were designed to prevent the public disclosure of information about impossible technologies or supernatural abilities, while providing a legal framework for authorizing elimination operations. The funding for Project Clearwater operations came from sources that were hidden within the budgets of multiple government agencies, using accounting methods that made it impossible to track the true cost of the program. Conservative estimates suggest that the program consumed billions of dollars over its operational lifetime, with much of the expense going toward the development of countermeasures and containment technologies. The international implications of Project Clearwater operations were managed through diplomatic channels that were designed to prevent foreign governments from learning about the exotic capabilities that had been developed by American cult groups. Intelligence agencies worked to suppress information about the elimination operations while monitoring for signs that similar groups were operating in other countries. The technology transfer agreements that were established with allied nations involved sharing selected countermeasures and detection equipment while maintaining strict secrecy about the source of these technologies. These agreements provided mutual protection against exotic threats while ensuring that the full extent of American capabilities remained classified. The scientific communities in allied nations were monitored for signs of research that might lead to the development of exotic technologies, with intelligence agencies working to redirect or suppress studies that could result in the creation of new cult-like organizations. This monitoring extended to universities, research institutions, and private laboratories that were conducting work in areas that had been identified as potentially dangerous. The educational systems in regions where elimination operations had been conducted were carefully monitored to prevent the transmission of dangerous knowledge to new generations. Libraries, schools, and museums were systematically purged of materials that might contain information about the eliminated cults, with replacement materials that presented sanitized versions of local history. The media coverage of events in former cult territories was carefully managed through relationships with news organizations that had been cultivated over decades of intelligence operations. Journalists who attempted to investigate unusual phenomena in these areas found their sources uncooperative, their access restricted, and their stories subjected to editorial interference that prevented accurate reporting. The witness protection programs that were established for individuals who had knowledge of elimination operations involved relocation to communities that were specifically designed to provide secure environments for people who possessed dangerous information. These communities operated under cover identities that made them indistinguishable from normal towns, while providing specialized services for their unique residents. The psychological support systems that were developed for witnesses and survivors included the treatment methods that were based on research into consciousness manipulation and memory modification techniques. These systems could selectively suppress traumatic memories while preserving essential information, allowing individuals to function normally while maintaining their value as intelligence assets. The recruitment procedures for Project Clearwater operations involved identifying individuals who possess the psychological resilience and specialized knowledge necessary to deal with impossible situations. These individuals were often recruited from backgrounds in military special operations, intelligence work, and scientific research, providing them with the skills necessary to understand and counter exotic threats. The training facilities that were established for Project Clearwater personnel were located in areas that had been secured through the same methods used to contain former cult territories. These facilities provided controlled environments where personnel could be exposed to simulated versions of the phenomena they would encounter in actual operations, allowing them to develop the skills and psychological conditioning necessary for success. The equipment that was developed for Project Clearwater operations incorporated technologies that were derived from the study of artifacts recovered from eliminated cults. This equipment provided capabilities that were decades ahead of anything available to conventional military forces, including weapons that could disrupt reality distortion fields, communication systems that operated across dimensional barriers, and protective gear that could shield personnel from consciousness manipulation effects. The logistics support for Project Clearwater operations required the establishment of supply chains that could provide specialized equipment and materials while maintaining absolute secrecy about their purpose. These supply chains operated through networks of contractors and subcontractors who were compartmentalized to prevent any single entity from understanding the full scope of the program. The medical support systems that were developed for Project Clearwater personnel included treatments for conditions that didn't exist in conventional medicine, such as dimensional displacement syndrome, consciousness fragmentation, and reality distortion exposure. These treatments were based on research that was conducted at facilities that were hidden within legitimate medical institutions, providing cover for the development of exotic medical technologies. The retirement procedures for Project Clearwater personnel involved comprehensive debriefing processes that ensured the security of classified information while providing appropriate support for individuals who had been exposed to traumatic and impossible situations. These procedures included memory modification techniques that could selectively remove dangerous knowledge while preserving the individual's ability to function normally in civilian life. The archive systems that were established for Project Clearwater materials included storage facilities that were designed to contain documents, artifacts, and specimens that possessed potentially dangerous properties. These facilities operated under security protocols that exceeded those used for nuclear weapons, with access restricted to individuals who had been specially trained to handle exotic materials. The research programs that were established to study materials recovered from elimination operations continued long after the original Project Clearwater mandate had ended, evolving into permanent institutions that conducted ongoing investigation of exotic phenomena. These programs provided the foundation for government capabilities that extended far beyond simple cult suppression, creating technologies that could influence the fundamental nature of human civilization. The legacy of Project Clearwater operations continues to influence government policy today, providing precedents for the elimination of threats that challenge existing power structures while establishing systems of control that operate outside democratic oversight. The technologies and capabilities that were developed through these operations remain classified at the highest levels, but their effects can be seen in the steady advancement of government capabilities that officially have no connection to cult research. The 7 cults that were eliminated from Appalachian history represent only a small fraction of the groups that were targeted by Project Clearwater operations, but their cases provide insight into the methods and technologies that were developed to address threats that conventional law enforcement couldn't handle. The elimination of these groups established precedents that continue to influence government responses to exotic threats, creating a system of control that extends far beyond the mountain communities where these conflicts first emerged. The ongoing effects of these elimination operations can be seen in the continued monitoring of former cult territories, the development of technologies that were derived from cult research, and the establishment of permanent institutions that are dedicated to identifying and neutralizing exotic threats. The government's response to the Appalachian cults created a shadow world where the boundaries between possible and impossible, between individual freedom and collective security, between known reality and hidden truth, remain permanently blurred. The most disturbing revelation about Project Clearwater's legacy lies not in what was eliminated, but in what was preserved. According to documents leaked by former Pentagon analyst Sarah Chen in 2009, the government didn't simply destroy the exotic technologies developed by these cults, they weaponized them. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency established a classified division known only as Department X in 1976, tasked with reverse engineering cult artifacts and developing military applications for consciousness manipulation, reality distortion, and dimensional bridging technologies. The implications of this research extend far beyond conventional warfare. Intelligence reports from the 1990s describe weapon systems that could alter enemy perception of reality, communication networks that operated across dimensional barriers, and surveillance capabilities that could monitor thoughts and intentions rather than just actions. These technologies were allegedly tested during conflicts in the Middle East, where their effects were disguised as psychological warfare or attributed to conventional weapons systems. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Project Clearwater's continuation involves what former Department X researcher Michael Torres called the insurance policy. According to Torres, who disappeared shortly after attempting to publish his memoirs in 2007, the government has maintained active samples of the consciousness transfer technology developed by the Order of Perpetual Midnight. This technology allegedly serves as a fail-safe system designed to preserve the essential leadership of the United States government in the event of catastrophic national emergency. The system, which Torres referred to as Project Phoenix, supposedly maintains consciousness backups of key political and military leaders, allowing them to be restored to new host bodies if their original forms are destroyed. The implications of this capability are staggering. It suggests that some of the individuals who appear to be governing the United States may not be the original personalities they claim to be, but rather consciousness transfers operating in carefully prepared host bodies. The evidence supporting Torres's claims comes from patterns of behavior among government officials who have displayed knowledge and capabilities that seem inconsistent with their documented backgrounds. Intelligence analysts have noted cases where political leaders have demonstrated expertise in areas they never studied, made references to events they couldn't have personally witnessed, and displayed personality changes that suggest fundamental alterations in their consciousness. The monitoring systems established to track cult survivors have also evolved into a comprehensive surveillance network that extends throughout American society. The technologies developed for detecting dimensional distortions and consciousness anomalies have been adapted for monitoring the general population, creating capabilities that can identify individuals who possess unusual mental abilities or knowledge that challenges official narratives. This surveillance network operates through a combination of electronic monitoring, psychological profiling, and what intelligence documents describe as consciousness scanning, techniques that can assess an individual's mental state and knowledge base without their awareness. The system identifies potential threats based on patterns of thought and behavior that suggest exposure to exotic phenomena or possession of dangerous knowledge. The individuals who are flagged by this system become subjects of ongoing monitoring and potential intervention. The methods used to neutralize these threats have evolved from the crude elimination techniques used against the original cults to sophisticated programs that can manipulate behavior, modify memories, and redirect life circumstances to prevent the development of dangerous capabilities. The preemptive intervention programs that emerged from Project Clearwater operations now target thousands of individuals annually, using methods that range from subtle psychological manipulation to direct physical intervention. These programs operate through networks of informants and agents who are embedded throughout American society, providing real-time intelligence about potential threats and the capability to respond immediately when dangerous individuals are identified. The success of these programs depends on maintaining the illusion of normalcy while systematically eliminating any individual or group that might challenge the established order. The methods used are so sophisticated that most targets never realize they are being manipulated, experiencing what appear to be natural sequences of unfortunate events that prevent them from achieving their goals or developing their capabilities. The technologies that enable these operations continue to evolve, incorporating advances in neuroscience, psychology, and quantum physics that provide ever more precise methods for controlling human behavior and consciousness. The research programs that support these developments operate under cover of legitimate academic and military research, ensuring that the true purpose of their work remains hidden from public scrutiny. The ultimate goal of these programs appears to be the creation of a society where exotic phenomena and dangerous knowledge are permanently suppressed, ensuring that the power structures established in the wake of the cult elimination operations remain unchallenged. The methods used to achieve this goal have created a form of invisible authoritarianism that operates through the systematic manipulation of individual consciousness rather than obvious political oppression. The 7 cults eliminated from Appalachian history were not the end of the story. They were the beginning of a transformation in how power is exercised in American society. The government's response to these groups established precedents and capabilities that continue to shape the hidden reality of modern life, creating a world where the boundaries between individual freedom and collective control have been permanently altered. The evidence I've presented represents only a fraction of the documentation that exists regarding these operations, but it provides insight into one of the most significant and least understood aspects of recent American history. The elimination of the Appalachian cults established methods and precedents that continue to influence government policy today, creating a system of control that operates largely outside public awareness while fundamentally altering the nature of human freedom and possibility. The legacy of these 7 cults lives on not in the communities that were destroyed, but in the technologies and capabilities that were developed to destroy them. These tools of elimination have become instruments of control that shape the hidden reality of modern American society, ensuring that the kinds of transformative possibilities represented by the cults will never again be allowed to emerge. In the end, the government's success in erasing these 7 cults from history may have eliminated more than just dangerous religious groups. It may have eliminated humanity's potential for transcendence itself, creating a world where the only possibilities that remain are those that serve the interests of existing power structures. The true cost of this victory may not be fully understood for generations to come, but the evidence suggests that what was lost in the mountains of Appalachia was far more significant than what was preserved.